In 1883, in a fog-drenched village in the mountains of North Carolina, 31 pilgrims climbed into a wooden attic for a vigil, and according to the remaining documents, none of them ever came back down. As you listen to this story, if you like, write in the comments which city you are listening from and what time it is there now. Coldmarsh, at the time, barely appeared on maps. It was just another forgotten spot among dark hillsides, damp valleys, and stretches of forest that always seemed on the verge of rain. Those who passed by on the dirt road saw only a few grey plank houses, a small warehouse with peeling paint, and a long barn built slightly above the marsh, with a sloping roof and narrow slit-like windows. That was where the Coldmarsh sisters lived and worked. County records describe Coldmarsh in cold lines: number of inhabitants, harvests, overdue taxes, complaints about fences knocked down by floods. But in the margins of these reports, in different handwritings, smaller notes appear. Reserved community, people who speak softly, prolonged rains, road almost impassable in winter. Coldmarsh was a place where life dragged on in silence, guided more by the weather and the mud than by any grand plan. The Coldmarsh sisters, as they would come to be called in newspaper articles and travellers' letters, were two widows, Abigail and Mercy. There are no official portraits of the two, only descriptions scattered in testimonies collected decades later. They speak of middle-aged women, thin, always covered in dark shawls, with hands marked by work and faces that rarely showed a full smile. Both had lost their husbands very early, one buried in a mining accident, the other taken by violent pneumonia after a particularly rainy winter. After these losses, the sisters returned to the family estate in Coldmarsh. The main house, made of wood, faced the road. Behind it, however, stood two more striking structures: the rectangular barn, and above it, a long loft, an enclosed space known to locals as the Night Loft. It was there that poor travellers, late carters, and later groups of worshippers gathered for overnight stays, prayers, and vigils. Tax documents classify it only as a storage annex. The minutes of the small local congregation, however, use another expression: upper hall for night devotions. A partially preserved notebook belonging to an itinerant pastor refers to the place as that vigil loft of the widowed sisters, describing it as a cramped space with a worn floor, where the boards creaked under the weight of knees and where candles cast elongated shadows on the ceiling beams. At that time, Coldmarsh lived off timber, small plantations and cargo passing through the region on its way to larger cities. The community was small, but marked by a particular kind of quiet discipline. There are almost no records of serious crimes, few legal disputes, and no episodes of open violence in the official archives. The biggest concerns seem to be the swamp floods, outbreaks of disease after the cold months, and debts to the store. Within this discreet setting, the Coldmarsh sisters occupied a peculiar place. They were not seen as dangerous, nor were they exactly beloved. Above all, they were necessary. They offered cheap shelter to those who arrived after sunset, sold thick soup and stale bread, and, for a small contribution, granted access to the Night Loft to groups who wished to spend the night in prayer or retreat. In later testimonies, former residents recall that they spoke little, but never denied a bed, and that no one knew exactly how much money came in or out of that house, only that the barn was never empty for long. The winter of 1883 arrived early in Coldmarsh. Weather reports from the region, preserved in newspapers from neighboring counties, speak of weeks of damp cold, low fog, and roads swallowed by mud. This combination of rain and fog made the village even more isolated. Wagons got stuck, horsemen gave up on continuing their journey, and some travellers were practically pushed into the sisters' shelter for lack of an alternative. It is in this context that the first mentions of pilgrims appear in the documents. This was not an official caravan, nor a widely recognized religious movement. Evidence suggests that they were members of small scattered congregations, people who mixed traditions, sermons from itinerant preachers, and ancient fears. A note preserved in the collection of a local pastor contains the phrase, "I have heard that a group of afflicted souls will ascend to the loft of the Coldmarsh widows to seek relief from the weight of this winter." The word Pilgrims appears for the first time on a list scribbled in faded ink, glued to the back of a tithe register. There are no full surnames, only initials and small comments. Widow, young man, sick man, stranger, mother with mute child. In all, 31 incomplete names lined up in a column, with the improvised title, Pilgrims for the Night Vigil, February 1883. Abigail and Mercy, according to oral accounts collected many decades later, did not usually ask too many questions. They accepted the groups, prepared the space in the night loft, lit a few lamps, left buckets of water and blankets, and retired to the downstairs. Some neighbors said they went upstairs for a brief prayer with the Pilgrims before the vigil. Others swore that the sisters never crossed the loft door after nightfall. The common thread between the versions is that the attic had gradually become more than just a shelter. It was a place where people went up carrying their worries, and they say came down the next morning with changed faces, sometimes relieved, sometimes empty, always silent. What caught the attention of the researcher who, decades later, reconstructed the case was not only the existence of such a large group going up to that attic on a winter night. It was the uncomfortable combination of two things: the presence, on the same sheet, of the exact number of pilgrims, 31, and the sudden interruption of the records shortly thereafter. In the local congregation's minute book, kept in the damp basement of a small renovated temple, there is a regular sequence of notes: Sunday services, visits from preachers, discreet weddings, hurried funerals. Date after date, everything follows a predictable rhythm. Until, between the pages for January and March 1883, there is a blank space. Where there should be reports of meetings and sermons, there is only a short note squeezed into the bottom margin of the page. Pilgrims' Vigil in the Coldmarsh Sisters Loft. 31 went up. No names confirmed after the night. There is no explanation. There is no official account of what happened between the moment those people left the damp floor of Coldmarsh and the moment the minutes book returns to recording as if nothing had happened. A simple regular service, reduced attendance. The strangeness increases when one looks at the county's own record book. In the line that would correspond to possible disappearances or mass deaths during that period, there is only a long ink mark, as if someone had started to write and given up. Next to it, in smaller, more hurried handwriting, is a sentence that time has almost erased, but which can still be read with effort. Regarding the 31 from Coldmarsh, nothing has been officially declared. It is in this void, in this silence between notes, on this page that seems to have swallowed an entire story, that the case of the Night Loft Pilgrims begins. And it is precisely there, in that blank space between one date and another, that the few remaining documents reveal a detail that should not be there. A dark ink fingerprint next to the number 31, as if someone had tried to erase it, and at the same time, make it impossible to forget. It is from this silent mark, lost in the margin of a forgotten book, that the reconstruction of the night, when 31 pilgrims climbed into the Coldmarsh Sisters' attic and never returned, begins to take shape. Before the night of February 1883 became a definitive boundary between what is known and what will never be clarified, Coldmarsh followed its usual rhythm, a place where time seemed to move more slowly than the wind that swept across the hillsides. This block reconstructs, from fragments of late testimonies, letters from residents, and scattered archives, the daily life that preceded the disappearance of the 31 pilgrims. Those who lived in Coldmarsh during that decade described the village as a place of short steps, where people greeted each other with discreet nods and avoided long conversations outdoors because of the damp cold that penetrated their bones. Mornings always began with low fog, which only dissipated when the sun managed to break through the heavy winter clouds. The wood of the houses remained damp almost all year round. Smoke from wood-burning stoves rose straight up, silently coloring the landscape with a constant gray. The rotation of tasks was predictable. Women lit stoves, men checked fences and chopped wood. Children walked to the small makeshift school that operated in a building with only 2 rooms. The Coldmarsh store, a simple structure with wooden shelves and a counter worn from heavy use, was everyone's unwitting meeting place. There, news arrived from travelers, reports of distant sermons, rumors of disease, and sometimes stories of religious groups circulating in the region. That was how the residents began to hear about pilgrims seeking purification by night. The reports describe small groups traveling on foot or in poorly prepared wagons, carrying simple supplies and, in many cases, a quiet determination. The harsh winter that year had intensified fears and beliefs. Disease had taken 2 children from the village. Floods had destroyed crops, and the persistent rain seemed to double the weight of each day. It is not difficult to understand why so many sought some kind of spiritual comfort. Sisters Abigail and Mercy observed all this from afar, or at least that is how they appear in the records, as figures who were always present but never at the center of the story. They opened the night loft on specific days, usually during the coldest weeks, when travelers had nowhere to go, or when small groups wanted to hold voluntary vigils. According to testimonies preserved in interviews conducted in the early 20th century, the sisters maintained a strict routine. In the morning, Abigail fed the few chickens and checked the barn. Mercy devoted herself to cooking, preparing thick vegetable broths, dark bread, and a mixture of herbs she called stamina tea. Both wore dark clothes, almost always the same shawls, and spoke in a controlled tone, as if each word had a weight that could not be wasted. A former neighbor would recall decades later. They seemed to carry winter inside them, but there was a kind of order in them. Everything they did was measuredly correct, as if they were obeying their own calendar. However, some details of their daily lives suggest that something was beginning to change in the months leading up to their disappearance. 2 records stand out. The first appears in the diary of an itinerant pastor who visited Coldmarsh in late January. The widows opened the loft to a larger group than usual. I'm not sure who organized it, but I noticed tension in Abigail's eyes. She spoke little, even less than usual. The second record comes from a woman who lived near the marsh and said she saw lanterns moving along the path leading to the barn late at night. It wasn't a vigil night. Still, someone went up. These are isolated notes, incapable of forming a complete picture, but they gain meaning today when we look at the chronology of the case. On the Pilgrims' side, the information is fragmented, almost always indirect. We know that they came from different places. 3 of them had left Yancey County, 2 others from villages near Asheville, and some from the Tennessee border. They were men, women, young and old, all going through winter for some intimate need, hoping to find a kind of spiritual clearing in the night loft. A collection of letters gathered by relatives and preserved in varying degrees suggests that many of them carried accumulated guilt, grief, or anxiety. A widow who had lost her son to a sudden fever, a young man seeking to renew his courage after failing to support his family, a sick traveler looking for a place where he could talk to God before his body gave up. None of this was unusual for the time, and perhaps that is why no one initially found it strange that such a large group was willing to go up to the loft that night. The reports also show that during the afternoon before the disappearance, the atmosphere in Coldmarsh seemed to be shrouded in a thicker silence than usual. One resident wrote in a letter to his sister, "The air was still. Nothing moved in the marsh. Even the houses seemed to hold their breath." It is at this point that we begin to observe convergences between different testimonies, convergences that, while they do not clarify the mystery, help to reconstruct its atmosphere. In 3 different accounts, collected on different dates and under different conditions, the same observation about the Coldmarsh sisters emerges. There was something about the way they looked at the loft that week, a kind of weariness, or waiting. It is impossible to know for sure what this weariness meant. Perhaps it was just the weight of winter, the difficulty of managing the property alone, the effort to keep travelers fed, and the loft minimally tidy. Still, the repetition of this perception, made by people unrelated to each other, raises questions about what was going on inside that house. The daily routine of the previous days seems to be punctuated by small signs, none explicit, none conclusive, but which together create the feeling that Coldmarsh was slowly and silently moving toward a breaking point. A man who traveled through the region reports that, as he passed in front of the barn, he heard a sharp sound, like the dragging of a beam or the impact of something heavy against the ground. A resident said she saw Mercy talking to herself near the entrance to the loft, as if practicing sentences before repeating them to someone. Still, life went on. The village went on. Winter went on. Until, on the afternoon of February 9th, the wagons began to arrive. One by one, the travelers descended the damp road, approaching the barn. And according to the few who witnessed the scene, there was a rare expression on their faces. Not hope, but a grave kind of determination. As the sun set behind the mountains, Abigail opened the loft door. Mercy adjusted some lanterns. The Pilgrims took their first steps into the attic. And the residents who saw that moment, at least those who were still alive decades later, remember feeling something they couldn't name. One of them summed it up this way: "It was like watching the last page of a book being turned, and realizing that none of the names on it would ever appear again." What happened after the door closed is what we will investigate in the next section. The development and climax of the night, when 31 pilgrims climbed into the Coldmarsh Sisters Night Loft. The night of February 9, 1883, remains, to this day, one of the most indecipherable pages in the Coldmarsh archives. To reconstruct it, historians and chroniclers have resorted to scattered fragments, belated testimonies, ink marks on records, loose notes, and the silent geography of the place itself. There is no direct account of what happened in the night loft, only the outlines left by the last people who saw the pilgrims alive. It is within these gaps that the case gains its deepest tension. Around 5 in the afternoon, the light was already beginning to descend the slopes of North Carolina with the thick slowness typical of winter. The marsh next to the barn remained still, without the usual noise of amphibians. It was as if the cold had silenced even nature. A light wind blew between the boards of the structure, causing the loft to creak intermittently, as if it were breathing. With each gust, the roof seemed to emit a muffled sound, and some neighbors would later claim that it was like a house trying to remember something. The 31 pilgrims began to gather in front of the barn shortly before sunset. It was not a uniform group. There were men in worn coats, women wrapping their shoulders in patched shawls, a teenager holding his mother's hand, a sick man leaning on a makeshift cane. Their expressions, however, converged on the same point. A concentrated silence, something between expectation and surrender. Abigail appeared at the barn door with slow steps, as if weighing the significance of the moment. Her face was partially covered by a dark shawl, and her gaze swept over the group in a restrained, almost analytical manner. Behind her, Mercy held 2 lanterns, which cast a yellowish light on the boards, creating narrow, elongated shadows that moved as she walked. No document records any words exchanged between them and the pilgrims. Some witnesses mention only that Abigail made a simple, firm nod of her head, indicating the narrow staircase that led to the loft. It was a steep, old staircase, with makeshift handrails and steps that creaked under the slightest weight. One by one, the pilgrims began to climb, and with each step, the sound of wood echoed through the barn, multiplying as if several staircases were being used at the same time. Mercy lit the lanterns attached to the upper beams, illuminating the way. And then, when the last pilgrim set foot on the first step, the wind seemed to cease completely. A heavy silence took over the night, as if Coldmarsh were waiting for something inevitable. The night loft was a cramped space with a low ceiling and thick beams supporting the roof. There were a few folded blankets on the floor, buckets of water, 2 metal basins, and a row of makeshift benches made of planks resting on bricks. The wood, darkened by moisture, smelled of ancient earth mixed with the scent of kerosene lamps. On the far wall, a small hand-carved crucifix hung crookedly, as if it had been placed there in a hurry. Descriptions are always inaccurate. Some late testimonies claim that, on that night, Abigail had gone up to the loft for a few moments before the vigil began. A pastor's diary mentions that the older widow murmured a few words that no one heard clearly. Other accounts, however, claim that none of the sisters crossed the threshold after the last person entered. What is known, because it is recorded in the account of a woman passing by on the road, is that the lamps were extinguished shortly after everyone went upstairs. She claims to have seen the light coming from the narrow windows disappear all at once, as if a large shadow had passed in front of them. The woman described it as a sudden darkening, without hesitation, without transition. Inside the loft, no one knows what happened in the early hours. A traveler who was sleeping at a neighboring farmer's house reported hearing something like a series of rhythmic footsteps, followed by a brief collective murmur. He could not make out any words, only the sensation that many people were speaking at the same time, in low tones, as if in a restrained prayer. The sound lasted a few minutes and then ceased completely. Another resident claimed to have noticed a faint glow coming through the cracks in the loft in the middle of the night, as if a lamp had been relit for a few moments. But there is no consensus on this. There is also a more controversial report that someone saw Abigail walking around the barn shortly after midnight, her hands clasped together as if she were holding something. This testimony has never been confirmed by other residents, but it appears in two different versions of the same statement taken 30 years later. The silence of that early morning became more intriguing due to the total absence of movement. Normally, those who slept in the loft would turn over during the night, cough, whisper, or make the floor creak. But on that particular vigil, there is not a single consistent sound recording. The few who lived nearby claim that, after the initial murmur, Coldmarsh plunged into an unnatural stillness. A complete silence, one of them described, as if the night were empty. It is not known when the vigil ended, or should have ended. Local tradition said that at dawn, the pilgrims would descend in single file, thank the sisters, and go their separate ways in silence. But on that cold morning of February 10th, Abigail and Mercy were seen walking unhurriedly in front of the barn, looking down the road as if waiting for someone. They did not seem alarmed, nor anxious. They seemed prepared. Hours passed without any pilgrims coming down. The sun broke through the slow fog, illuminating the side of the loft. The marsh began to thaw, breaking the whiteness of the landscape. A farmer passing by noticed that the loft door was still closed. He found it strange, though not deeply so, and continued on his way. Later, another resident noticed that the stairs remained empty, with no new footprints in the mud near the entrance. This did bother her. The mud kept everything, and that morning it showed only old marks, as if no one had walked there since the day before. Around noon, according to an official report, someone knocked on the sisters' door, asking if everything had gone well at the vigil. There is no record of the exact response, only a note written in shaky handwriting in a neighbor's diary. They said the vigil was peaceful, but that they were still waiting for the group to return. This phrase, waiting for their return, would become one of the most discussed by researchers. How do you wait for the return of someone who is only a few meters away? Why didn't the sisters go up to the loft? Or if they did, why is there no record of it? In the afternoon, uneasiness began to spread. Small groups of residents gathered near the warehouse. Others approached the road leading to the barn. The reports converge on a single observation. No voices, no footsteps, no movement came from the night loft. The exact moment when someone decided to go up remains unclear in the documents. Some say it was a neighbor, others a relative of one of the pilgrims. What is known is that 3 men, after exchanging a few words, walked to the barn around 4 in the afternoon. The first of them placed his hand on the stair railing, feeling the cold of the damp wood. The second carried a lit lamp, whose flame flickered when it came into contact with the draft coming down from the loft. The third just watched, tense, as if he already knew something was wrong. The 3 began to climb step by step, hearing the creaking of the stairs amplified by the empty barn. When they reached the top, the first man pushed the loft door. It opened with a sharp click, And what they saw inside was not what they expected to find. It wasn't noise, it wasn't voices, it wasn't people. It was just a silent, untouched space, as if the vigil had never happened. The blankets remained folded, the basins full, the benches lined up. There were no signs of struggle, no escape, no rush. The only detail out of place was a lamp fallen in the corner, still with a cold wick as if it had been knocked over hours before, but without ever having hit the floor violently. 31 pilgrims had gone up, but no human trace remained there. No footprints, no clothes, no knee marks on the floor. Nothing. Just the still air of the loft, and a silence so deep it seemed to carry the weight of all the questions Coldmarsh would never be able to answer. It is in this void that the next block begins, the community's reaction and the fragmented clues left behind after the disappearance. The discovery of the empty loft marked the beginning of one of the quietest and most uncomfortable investigations in Coldmarsh's history. The disappearance of the 31 pilgrims, with no signs of escape or physical presence, caused a kind of perplexity in the community that did not turn into immediate despair, but into a quiet fear that spread like damp fog through the houses and the short conversations in the store. The 3 men who found the night loft intact descended the stairs slowly without exchanging words. The first of them, Farmer Elias Porter, would note in his diary decades later, "I didn't feel fear. I felt a loss, as if the room had been created to shelter people, and that morning it was unlearning what that meant." This type of comment, although unusual, would be repeated in other later reports. The idea that the space itself seemed wrong, not empty, but too quiet, too tidy, too suspended in time. As soon as the news spread, small groups began to gather in front of the barn. The conversations were low, tense. Some wanted to call county authorities immediately. Others thought the pilgrims might have come down at dawn and headed in another direction. But the mud around the barn belied that hypothesis. There were no fresh footprints, no tire tracks, no sign of recent movement. As the afternoon wore on, the pressure on Abigail and Mercy increased. The sisters, however, maintained the same reserved demeanor. Abigail spoke little, always choosing her words with extreme care. Mercy kept her eyes down, her hands clasped in front of her apron, as if afraid to let go of something she was holding invisibly. When questioned for the first time, according to the deputy sheriff's record, Abigail reportedly replied only, "They went up. We didn't see anyone else." No inflection, no additional details. The initial search lasted just over a day. Men combed the marsh, followed nearby trails, climbed hillsides, entered abandoned warehouses. They found only irrelevant fragments, old footprints, traces left by travelers weeks before, branches broken by the wind, no sign that would allow them to reconstruct the pilgrim's route after entering the loft. The mood in the village shifted from strangeness to discomfort. There were no bodies, no lost objects, no witnesses to indicate commotion, fighting, shouting, or disorderly flight. All the community had were questions, and the constant gaze of the Coldmarsh sisters, always at the barn door, watching the road as if waiting for a late return. Around the 3rd day, the county sheriff finally arrived. A pragmatic, rigid man, he asked direct questions and took quick notes in a leather book. He examined the loft, touched the boards, smelled the lamps, tested the ladder and assessed the marsh. Nothing aroused clear suspicion. The official report, partially preserved, contains only 3 observations. No signs of violence. No evidence of exit through the loft during the night. Total absence of the pilgrims' personal belongings. The 3rd point is one of the most intriguing. There were no supplies, extra clothes, bags, nothing. This does not mean that they never took anything, only that the loft that morning held no evidence that 31 people had occupied the space for hours. The uncomfortable population began to weave their own versions. Some of them persisted for decades, crossing generations like small inherited rumors. That the pilgrims had been seen walking in silent file into the forest shortly before dawn. That a bonfire had been spotted in a distant valley, extinguished before anyone could reach it. that Abigail had received a mysterious letter days before the vigil, but that it had burned in her kitchen before anyone could read it. None of these stories found concrete support, but they all appear, fragmented, in the oral archives collected between 1908 and 1921. The Coldmarsh sisters' relationship with the community began to deteriorate rapidly. Once viewed with neutrality, they were now regarded with reserve. Some residents turned away when they saw them. Others stared at them as if searching for some trace of guilt. But the most disturbing thing was the sisters' own behavior. Mercy had become even more silent, as if economizing every gesture. Abigail, for her part, remained steadfast but restless. The local pastor said in a later statement, "She didn't seem guilty. She seemed to be waiting for something," as if the story wasn't complete yet. As the weeks passed, county authorities ended the formal search. The absence of bodies, clues, or concrete records made it impossible to classify the case. It was not murder. It was not an accident. It was not a proven escape. It was officially undetermined. But Coldmarsh could not live with this void. Some relatives of the Pilgrims remained in the area for months, searching trails, caves, clearings for any clue. Others left, resigned, taking with them only the bitter feeling that their last chance for spiritual reconciliation had ended in an attic that no one now dared to enter. The only material clue recorded in the archives was found about 6 weeks later. A piece of dark fabric attached to a nail in the outer beam of the barn. It was not enough for identification, and could have come from any winter coat of the time. Even so, the sheriff's assistant noted, "It appears to be finer fabric than that used in the region." But there was no further investigation. The record ends there. What then constitutes the revelation of this block, if there are no definitive answers? It is something more subtle, human, and deeply unsettling. Among the preserved accounts, there is a letter, the only one written in Abigail Coldmarsh's own hand found after her death. The paper, now faded, is filed away under special protection. It contains no confession, no mention of the missing, no reference to the loft. But at the end, it contains a sentence that researchers consider central to understanding the sisters' emotional state at that time. Some absences are greater than presence itself, and some vigils end before dawn. It is the only time Abigail wrote something that seems to touch, albeit obliquely, on the disappearance of the Pilgrims. It does not reveal facts, but it reveals atmosphere, resignation, heaviness, silence. The official investigation never reached a conclusion. Over the years, the community learned to live with the absence as one lives with a prolonged winter, without denying it, without understanding it, just enduring it. The loft remained closed for a long time. The sisters continued to live on the property, aging at a slow pace. None of them ever reopened the night loft for vigils. But among the pages of the archives, there is one final detail. An anonymous note found years later, folded inside a book in the warehouse. Written in uneven handwriting, it simply said, "They did not come down because they did not find what they were looking for." And it is with this enigma, simple, brief, uncomfortable, that we move on to the epilogue. Decades later, the narrator-historian will reflect on the weight of this case, on the silence that surrounds Coldmarsh, and on what the absence of the Pilgrims still means to those who try to reconstruct history.